Hello, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted for you all to be here and join us for this Liberty in Progress half-day conference hosted by the LSE Hayek programme and the Hayek Society. Now, just a quick show of hands, who has heard of F.A. Hayek? Okay, interesting. Well, hopefully we'll be able to change that at some point throughout this conference as well. Well, we're going to kick off, first of all, with a presentation by Professor Daniel Waldenstrom, who is a professor of economics in IFN Stockholm, specialising in wealth inequality. He will discuss insights from his book, Richer and More Equal, exploring how political and institutional changes enabled wealth democratisation. Over to you.
Thanks for inviting me, and I'm just getting a little bit organized here with what this is, what kind of crowd this is. But I think there's a lot of students in here, knowing about what I'm going to talk about to a little extent, at least. So I'm going to talk about society, and talking about the strain between economic development and distribution. One of the biggest and most kind of central question of economics since many years. How to cope with our aim to have as good a life as possible, and yet to include as many to be part of that life. This talk is going to center around. The talk is going to center around a book that I wrote. This is a copy I brought. I can actually circulate it in the crowd, so you can look at it, and then it's going to be a measure of trust. If it doesn't come back, then I update my trust on like belief on trust level in the UK, or LSE maybe. But anyway, this talk is about wealth ownership, wealth inequality, and also to some extent how to think about what role for policy do we have in order to think about redistributing resources in the population. So it's going to be an historical talk as well. So as you can see from the title, which is the title of the book, Richer and More Equal, A New History of Wealth in the West. And the talk is framed around the book in the sense that it's a book also written to some extent to the academic readership. So I'm going to review my own research on trends in inequality, in wealth ownership from several Western economies. So it's going to be a focus on the Western world. I will give you one slide on the global scene. Bear with me. But it's going to be a focus on facts, data, and also talking to the previous research that some of you may have seen with my friend and former colleague Thomas Piketty, who has been framing a lot of this discussion on these questions. So, questions that I'm going to ask, that we're going to talk about today: what is wealth? What do we own? What are the components of the wealth that we hold? How has this ownership played out in the population in terms of the distribution of wealth? And how has this ownership and the inequality changed over time? And what can we learn from studying this, both in terms of understanding how the economy and how society works, but also maybe what the lessons for policy are? This is an academic context, so if you have questions, short questions, which could be of clarifying matter, so please raise up your hand and then ask. I mean, it could be a definitional thing. I'm trying to be as little home stage blind as possible, but there may be some of these things. And in fact, wealth is a complicated topic. Of all the economic outcomes that we talk about in welfare, wealth is among the most complicated ones. Anyway, so I'm not the first to talk about long-term trends in wealth ownership and wealth inequality. Unfortunately, much of my research, I've been doing research for more than 20 years, it has not been cases where I've been the first to ask questions. So there has been a discussion and research on this. One aspect which I think is problematic is that this previous research has been quite one-sided in its take on wealth ownership, wealth inequality. So I call it maybe the dominant narrative or the previous or old narrative. And as you can see in the title, one framing would be the rich are the problem. So the research on wealth inequality trends has been to one extent, so the first part here is about how has it looked when we look at history. We can see from history that wealth has become more equally distributed. And how has that come about? And I would say, and I would argue that what researchers so far have said that the reason is that we have taken down the rich. We have lowered the top of the distribution. And this has been the main driver of equalization. And this has come about for one part from shocks to capital, wars, destroying factories, infrastructure, stuff that the rich held. Basically destroying their capital and making gaps lower between them and the rest of the population. And also, secondly, from capital taxation. So redistributing wealth by taking it from the rich and giving it to the rest of the population. Those have been the main drivers of equalization of wealth, according to the previous, I would say, literature on these questions. And the second part, in order to understand also how I will deviate in interpreting the facts and in interpreting the way forward, is to see that the rich, according to previous researchers, do not really contribute to society. They are rich maybe because of entrepreneurship, but mostly because they are lucky. But some are heirs as well. They have not lifted a finger, they have just received money. Some are crooks, thieves. I mean, that's for sure. We have oligarchs. And in a way, they have not really contributed a lot by becoming rich. And in fact, much of the research in economics is a very static research. The role of entrepreneurs is not very much there. This is even in mainstream economics. The questions on how does growth come about, for a long time it was very much about mechanical view on capital accumulation and so on. The dynamism has been very absent. And I think that's a problem. And also that becomes problematic in terms of interpreting increasing gaps, because then they will always be interpreted as something bad. Rising inequality is always bad. But we can think of reasons or examples where this is not necessarily the case. Anyway, since my colleague Thomas Piketty, a former colleague, talked about this and framed it in such a manner, there has been new research coming around, and mostly by adding data from other countries. So historical data are problematic. It takes a lot of time to create time-consistent series of wealth ownership and wealth inequality. But we've learned and we've become better and better. So in my main data sample for the long-run framework, where I'm going to talk about 130 years, I will have 6 countries in the main sample. That would be the UK, France, Germany, Spain, the US, and Sweden. I will also show you some other countries so that you can see whether we can also bear out the main trends for other countries. But these are the countries for which we have the main variables that we can play around with with understanding both the evolution of wealth ownership and the size of the economic pie, but also the division of it. So what comes out of the data, and also how I want to frame the data, are collected in these 3 lines. If you should remember anything, remember this slide. I really want these people to see it as well, so please come on. So the first fact is actually, and this is the kind of fact from historical wealth analysis, we're richer today. I think this is not so difficult to sign up for. So we can look around and we can see the quality of our infrastructure and the lives that we live. Looking at our cars and so on, we have higher values in our economies than we've ever had in history. The second fact is more complex. Wealth is different today. I will come back to this, but in fact the composition of assets that comprise wealth in society has changed profoundly. And this has also implications for the third fact: we are more equal today. So we're richer today. This is easy to show. This is a graph showing the average real wealth value of households in these 6 Western countries that I study. And as you can see, it just goes up. We could look at, this could be GDP per capita, this could be maybe daily nutrition in the population or anything, it could be length, like longevity. It goes up. We're richer and wealthier today. Wealth is different today, is more shown in this graph. And this is a graph showing you the composition of total wealth. So on the standing axis, we have from 0 to 100%, the value of all assets. And then there's over time. And I've divided these assets into two main groups. One, what I call people's wealth, is the stuff that most people own. Namely, we own our homes, and we own pension funds, the long-term savings. I'm sure that the majority in this group, maybe with some examples, but this is what you look at when you're looking into your own balance sheets or the balance sheet of your parents. This is going to be very dominant in terms of assets. Then there are other kinds of assets, what I call elite wealth, like agricultural domains, estates, could be shares in specific industrial corporations. And as you can see, the relative share of the stuff that people own was relatively small 100 years ago, 25%. 1/4 of all wealth was in the hands of assets that the assets that normal people owned, or households, or the broad population. But then we can see this has increased. So today, in actually most Western economies, the majority of values in society are those that people hold. The ordinary working households, middle-class households. Meaning that, and this has implications, when asset prices go up, like house prices or even stock prices, this is going to benefit also the people holding these assets, either in terms of homes or pension funds. Pension funds, as you know, are mutual funds that are typically invested in shares in the stock markets. So this has profound implications, and this is also shown in how equality of ownership has evolved. This graph is one way to show this. There are several different measures of equality or inequality. This picture shows you the average value of wealth held by either the poorest 90% of the population. So basically people owning nothing to those who own something, and then up to some higher upper middle class people. Then that's the 90th percentile. That's the dashed blue line. And that you can see, and then the other one is the richest percentile. So if you line up everybody from poorest to richest, divide the population into 100 equally sized groups, then we take the top group, the richest percent. The average wealth in this group is the red line. And you can see that small group owned more, many times more than the 90 poorest percentiles 100 years ago. But then something happened. The dashed blue line starts increasing, especially during the post-war era. And it has continued to do so. So it has surpassed this red line of the rich group. So, of course, there are many fewer people in the rich red group, so on average they are richer. But we can see here a big catching up effect in wealth ownership over time. And another result comes out here. So the red line, as you can see, has gone up a lot in recent years. So is that reasonable? Does it square with the fact? Well, I think so. We can see the number of billionaires, they have increased. I mean, and the size, the things that they own are just like sometimes unimaginable. In the red line here, we have the names that we read about in the news. Especially, I don't want to name also some of these names, but there are people who have championed the world market for environmental friendly cars, but then has started doing other things lately, etc., etc. But fascinatingly enough, that increase in wealth among billionaires has not crowded out the wealth growth amongst the others. So also middle-class people have enjoyed higher wealth values over the recent decades. And this is kind of exhibit A against a zero-sum game of the world. So that the zero-sum view says that if someone gains, someone else has to lose. This is not true when we look at our economic histories. In fact, it goes against the view of how growth works. You could even say that growth is to both eat the pie and also have it there. This is what growth does. It lifts everyone in different ways. And this is something that we can see. Looking at maybe the most important distributional graph that I will have to that I will show you today is this one. And here I have split up Europe and the US because they are so different in so many respects. But the left graph here, which is kind of has evolved as we have gotten more countries creating these time series of wealth inequality, is I think perhaps the most striking and most amazing graph. What does it show? Well, first of all, it shows that Europe was very unequal 100 years ago. So our equality is not something that has been built into our economies or societies. This is not what Europe has always been. No, in fact, we were very unequal. In fact, the UK, 100 years ago, around 1910, the degree of wealth concentration measured in the UK by a former professor at this school, Tony Atkinson, who died a few years ago, is I would think that that's the highest degree of wealth concentration that has ever been measured in any human society in mankind's history. So it was very, very unequal at around 1910, in the early 20th century. But then we can see that things changed. What happened? Well, 20th century happened. We see that in the UK, we see that also in France and in Germany, and also in Spain and in Sweden. They all follow the same pattern, which I think is very interesting. Why? Well, because it says something about the role of wars as being this pivotal force of equalization of wealth, but because Sweden and Spain, we weren't even in the world wars. And yet we follow the same equalizing trends over the 20th century. So there must be something else that drives equalization. But even more perhaps interesting is the era or the period after 1980. What have you heard about wealth equality in recent years? Do you typically hear that wealth equality has been very stable at historically low levels? Hasn't changed almost anything. Is that what we hear? I typically say when I'm in academia, in papers, if I would get a penny or like $1 for every paper that it begins with wealth inequality is increasing, has been increasing over the last decades, I would be much wealthier than I am today. And yet there are some of these trends increases, but they are at very low, historically low levels. And this, I will show you, comes about in many other countries as well. The US was more equal than Europe 100 years ago, but has also experienced an increasing degree of wealth concentration over the recent years. And this is not so much, again, about the zero-sum game. Also, the US middle class has experienced higher wealth values over the recent years, but their most successful entrepreneurs, company owners, have been the most successful in the world to create value in the more globalized markets. So that's also what's driving an increased wealth concentration in the US. So my book contains a lot of data. By the way, on my website, all of these data are freely downloadable. So you can just go there, take an Excel file or whatever, and then you play around. Here, I show you the same stuff, but only this is since 1980, zooming in a little bit and also expanding with more countries. So would it be that this historically low level that we saw in these 5 European countries, is that specific for them, the trendlessness? No. Here, when we look at the European picture to the left here, we can throw in Denmark, Finland, Netherlands. We can throw in also even UK, Australia, and Canada. And yet we see this relatively flat evolution. And how come we have that despite the soaring house prices or the soaring stock markets in the more and more globalized era? Then we have to come back to this compositional graph, this blue field. Showing that most of the assets in our economies are actually held by people like us, the working population, either in the homes we own or as mutual funds. So this is the book, and this is what I'm proposing here: that we are actually richer and more equal than ever in history. And then I propose that growth that we have seen in GDP increases, industrialization, plus institutions that have ensured that this growth has become more equally distributed. And what are these institutions? Democracy is the most important, I suppose. that came in the early 20th century, the extension of suffrage, that also then brought educational reforms, expanding attainment of education to more and more people and getting access to higher education, but also labor laws, making working places a better environment, safer, and that also made them workers more productive, increased their incomes, made them for the first time able to start saving. I will come back to this. And also that this then shows that lifting the bottom has been the main force. I will show this too, and this is totally clear in the data. And this goes against the old narrative that zoomed in on lowering the top, the destruction of capital of the rich, that as being the main drivers, wars as the key factor by creating wealth equalization. No, that's not what we see in the data, and I think the explanations are already on the table, the economic growth and the institutional change. So it's scary to present new things, and I'm not the only one who says this in a sense. And I had these thoughts in me working at the Paris School of Economics, eating lunch with Thomas Piketty and others. And then I wrote a paper that I showed to some people. And then I realized that there are many others who also share this view of how it has come about. And it's not nice to brag, but I'm very proud of that. These two guys have also been very positive in this new view of what has happened in history. So Daron Acemoglu to the left, he has endorsed this book and amongst others. So the guys who endorsed this was like Branko Milanovic, Greg Clark, economic historian, also David Sasavich, is a political scientist at NYU. The guy to the right is Jim Robinson. They received this economic prize, Nobel Prize. And I had asked Jim if I could show his email, but then, fantastic congratulations to the book. Yes, I certainly think that this is the right story. So with that, it feels good, and I think we're on to something here. And only a couple of weeks ago, I went to a conference where this guy, Arthur Apostel, had created a new series for Belgium. Belgium isn't around in my data, and it showed exactly the same long-run pattern. Long-run equalization and no increase in wealth inequality over the recent years. And I presume for the same reasons, for the same compositional reasons that ordinary people have become owners in our societies because of these factors. Alrighty, I will go through the data. Maybe we'll skip over a few graphs. I'll talk about them a little bit more quickly in the interest of time. My book contains two segments, or two big parts. One is building wealth. This is the size of the economic pie. Why is that important? Well, it's because this is growth. This is what the resources we're going to play around with. And I already told you. So how come ordinary people started building wealth? Well, this is because the intersection between economic growth, industrialization, new technologies, I think according to many, like if you read Joel Mocker, this is the key behind long-run growth, is technical change. But also these democratic institutions that made people sharing those gains much more actively. Workers became more productive. People started living longer, eating better food. We also built societies that were better for people. That created then homeownership and also pension funds and long-run savings. So homeownership rates have gone up during the 20th century. This is an ongoing project by Sebastian Kohl, a German sociologist, trying to calculate how large shares in the population own their homes. Mutual funds and pension funds have also become much more important over this period. Why? Well, simply we started living many more years after retirement age. So if you've read about this classical life cycle hypothesis, so Franco Modigliani, this Italian economist, basically postulating that we are poor as young, and then we start saving up until retirement, and then we eat up what we've saved, and then we die poor again. And this is actually shown that we started saving much more when we started living longer. Because in fact, retirement age was 65 even 100 years ago. It's just that people didn't live so many years after that. But now we are happy enough because of growth and prosperity, that to live also good lives as old. You may not think that you can live a good life beyond 65, but because it's too far away, but that's actually true. So anyway, another fact when we look at the data, so this is a compositional graph once again. I was amazed when I saw this, how similar it was across these countries. Housing wealth, long-run savings, together from 20% of total assets to maybe 75% of total assets in these 6 countries. A little bit difference in composition, but still. And this is because all of these countries have experienced economic growth, GDP growth, and technical change, of course, has been disseminated. And also, all of these countries have become democracies over the 20th century. Inequality, you've already seen this picture. So this is kind of the main wealth inequality graph in the historical era. We can always start different years and play around with different years and ending years. But this picture shows you that regardless of whether we start in 1980 or 1990 or 2000, we have some variations. But we have not, in any of these contexts in European countries here, left the historically equal region of wealth ownership. So this is the main take-home message. I told you there are other countries for which you have some data, typically worse data, because data are difficult. But what we see when we map these data for 8 other countries historically is that that at least does not show a completely different picture. It's just not that inequality has increased along with wealth growth. It has decreased in most of these countries, but you can see that the data are sometimes shorter, or maybe a little bit more uncertain. So I talked about the very rich. So this picture shows you the richest percentile within the richest percentile. So the top 10,000th in the distributions, taking the 10,000th richest and then compare their wealth with the rest of the rest. So one question, has this group totally skipped over this historical equalization, some elite separation idea that they could basically avoid becoming part of overall equalization? No, we can see that they have also experienced equalization. But we can also see that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, they have gained relatively more than the others moderately rich. So we can see specifically in the US, where the share of this super elite group has increased very rapidly. We can when we discuss whether, and I can have this as a question, is this a problem or not? That we have this wealth growth, this very rapid wealth growth in the top. Is that a problem? So once again, wars and capital taxes have, of course, mattered in different subtle ways. This picture shows you inheritance tax rates collected by 2 political scientists, Ken Sheave and David Sasavage. They wrote a book called, collected papers in a book called Taxing the Rich. It's a very good book, actually. What it shows is that, yes, it has mattered, but in fact, taxes started picking up much later than wealth started equalizing. So that's one question that one could have against taxes. And also, taxes are very different across these countries that all equalized in almost a similar manner. Also, putting a question mark. But of course, econometrically, it's very difficult to have convincing evidence on these relationships. Alrighty. So in the book and in my papers, I've tried to kind of decompose these forces driving equality change. Once again, trying to see, is it the top that fell down and created equalization, or is it the bottom that has increased? Here I show 3 groups of bars. So the white bar is the average annual change in the top percent wealth share. So you can see it's negative for the periods between 1910 up until 1980. These are the falling shares that you saw. Did they come about by falling top wealth, the dark bars? No. They didn't fall, or didn't decrease a lot, but they were almost unchanged or even increased in the post-war era. But what changed a lot was the growth of wealth in the bottom. This is what created the change. And we can see why. We can see because people started owning their homes after having become more productive in the labor market. They also started saving for building up private wealth for old age. And we're going to also here see that in the last era, the rich group has increased their wealth faster than the middle class, but it has once again not come at the expense of the middle class. Both these groups have experienced increasing real wealth, so consumption price corrected wealth values. So there are many aspects of wealth that we want to also raise. Some of them in terms of robustness check context. Do we measure the right thing or the same thing over time? I will go through these things a little bit quickly, but they are very important. I shower you now with some pictures, and I think there will be people who are maybe very interested in gender and wealth inequality or tax havens. I mean, I will give it that to you. Then that's going to see how this will play out. One thing is offshore wealth, so tax havens. Has it been that this equalization is just a measurement error? So that the rich have actually put their wealth in another column that we didn't measure? No, that's not the case. It is the wealth in offshore tax havens is skewedly held by rich people. That is what we think, and some research has shown that. But as you can see here, the left graphs compare total measured wealth in the disclosed national account with the additions from estimated offshore wealth. You can see that the differences are very small. So in the order of magnitude, this does not matter a lot. And to the right, we see how the top shares have developed. And these changes are very small too. Another and even more complex wealth measure is what I here call like social security wealth or unfunded pension wealth. So think of it as we pay taxes to our welfare states, and in return we get a promise of future incomes. Either it's as an insurance if we get sick, but also and mainly when we get old, we will get a pension income. This is kind of the pay-as-you-go system. So you can think of it as a maybe postponed salary, but we're taxed today, and we're gonna. But these money don't exist today in an account. But we can estimate. Think of the taxes that we pay. Imagine that we instead put them in a savings account. And we built up a financial wealth of our own, and these pictures does do that. So we see that when we create those wealth assets for individuals, we see that people are much wealthier than in the official account, and we can see to the right the equalization over time is even more pronounced. So this, of course, goes hand in hand with the growth of the welfare states, that the values embedded in the pension system will play a role and is more equally distributed and other kinds of wealth. Inheritance. Last week there was an article in the Economist about inherited wealth, the rise of inheritocracy or something, and it started its observation a little bit from the left, not a little bit, only the left panel here, that the flow of annual inheritances has increased in relation to national income. We can see to the right, in the left panel, it starts increasing. But we can also see that historically we are still at relatively low levels. And if you compare it, no, sorry, not the left, it's the middle, sorry, the middle one, inheritance flow over national income. But we can see also when we compare inheritance flow to the right with total wealth. We haven't had a very large increase in inheritance flows in that context. To the left, sorry, this is the share of all wealth that has been inherited. It's around half today, but it was 80% 100 years ago. So the share of self-made wealth has increased over time. This is another picture showing among the super rich. This is the share of heirs amongst the super rich in the Forbes billionaires listings since the 1980s in Sweden and in the US. And how has that developed? Has it gone up? Has inheritocracy become more prevalent amongst the super rich? No, it has actually decreased. And I think this is kind of what we also see with the rise of new technologies, new assets, and new values that are being created. I'm going to skip over a little bit women and wealth. Has that equality changed? Maybe that has increased over time. To the right, this is a Swedish picture showing the ratio between average male wealth and average female wealth. And that has gone down over the 20th century too. So also in that dimension, we are more equal today. Black wealth gap in the US, this is a paper from the QJE years ago, has also decreased by an order of magnitude. This is over a long time period. So it's not one, there's still a gap, but it's going down. Health is another dimension of well-being. So this picture shows you inequality in longevity, how many years we live. And this is asking the question, is this equalization of wealth unique for wealth? Maybe it's a unique thing. No. Inequality of lifespans has decreased even more. We are more equal in terms of perhaps the most important outcome that we think of, how many years we will live. And has this changed, this trend changed over the last years when we had these neoliberal revolutions in 1980 where everything else has gone on the wrong, in the wrong way, if you ask some people? No, it has continued to become more and more equal. So what about the global scheme? This picture shows you data from the last 20 years. So to the left we have all wealth in the world. It has increased. Why? Well, we can speculate. Globalization, trade, technologies, and so on. To the right, we see the Gini coefficient, the inequality of global wealth. For those of you who knows anything about the Gini coefficient, you know it values around 90, 89, 88, 99, 90, 91, very high values, because it's a very large inequality of wealth in the world. But it has decreased. Even there, it has decreased. Even in the global stage, at the global stage, we are richer and more equal. I think it's a nice kind of way to think about this. So we're richer, more equal, and growth in institutions have lifted the top. And then my final slide then, take-home messages. I write a little bit about this in the book, although most of my book is about measuring wealth, calculating these outcomes that you've seen. So zero-sum thinking is a quite detrimental way of viewing the world and the economy, and it doesn't really square with our economic history as well. Promoting private home ownership is one way to enrich people, to actually to reach the goal of both having a larger economic pie and a more equally distributed economic pie. And the same goes for funding private pension savings. Then capital taxation is needed. Let's tax capital income and skip away from symbolic capital taxes like wealth and inheritance. Maybe we can come back to that later. Wealth and welfare inequality. So there is one way of thinking about differences in resources. What if it has a very large impact on the quality of education for our kids it can have? Then of course that will give the kind of repercussions of wealth inequality another angle in relation to a society where we don't pay for the quality of education for our children. Finally, power. This is something that comes about in the discussion much more today than only a few years ago. Let me just say, first of all, there are powerful rich people, but I would say the vast majority of billionaires and rich people are not politically powerful. Why? They don't want to be that. They just want to run their businesses. And I think this is how we want to have things. We want the entrepreneurs to run their firms, to make them as profitable as possible, to create jobs, products and services, and also incomes and taxes. How should we think about this? I think Sweden is maybe a benchmark where we have H&M, we have IKEA, we have Spotify, we have Klarna, and yet we don't have a very politically corrupt system. So we've been able to shield off the politics from private money, transparency rules, trust, and so on. And the same goes for media. So that's the ideal, to have these systems working as intended, and let business people do what they do best: create value, jobs, products, and services, instead of breaking up wealth, as Lina Khan wanted to do in the US only the last year, in a suspicion about them becoming too powerful at some point in the future. No, let them do what they do well, because that's going to create prosperity and also more equality, I think. Okay, that's me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was absolutely brilliant. I thought we all learned a bit about the history of wealth inequality and how we have gotten to where we are today. So we will have time for questions and a bit of a panel discussion at the end. But first, but certainly not least, we're going to be hearing a bit from Sam Dumitriu, who is the head of policy of Britain Remade, and he's going to focus on economic growth and regulatory reform. So his presentation is specifically about builders and blockers, examining how the UK's failure to build exacerbates inequality and limits prosperity. So thinking about this in comparison to what we've heard just now from Professor Waldenstrom, thinking about it from the long-term perspective, but also what this means for regulation in the UK. Sam, over to you.
Sure. So thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks everyone for coming. So we often think about the problems of poverty and inequality in terms of what the state can do to sort of correct the harsh outcomes of the free market, right? Such as by redistributing incomes, creating new rights for workers, like imposing a floor on wages with minimum wage. Now, I don't want to criticise that approach tonight, but what I do think we need to accept is it's not the whole story. And while all of these things matter, for the welfare of the least well-off and the majority of society, just as important is productivity, in effect what people can earn in the marketplace, and also what those earnings can then buy. Now, my argument today is that regulations around what you can build, where you can build it, and how you build it, if at all, are the reason why British families are around £7,000 per year worse off than a French family, £8,000 per year worse off than a German family, and this is pretty staggering, £16,000 worse off than the average American family. And the regulations I'm talking about, rules such as the Green Belt, which prevents our cities from expanding, rules that mandate expensive environmental assessments and mitigations. You may have heard the Prime Minister talking about a £100 million bat tunnel, which that's now an out-of-date figure because the cost has risen to £121 million, but very, very expensive changes we put on infrastructure projects, and also rules like the rule we impose on nuclear power stations that have made a technology that was once cost competitive with coal, it didn't need a carbon tax to compete with coal, to one that now is many multiples more expensive than coal and gas. So I think these policies not only reduce incomes, but they also have a regressive impact, and they drive up the cost of items that the poorest disproportionately consume, and they limit the ability of people on low incomes to get on in life, to access more job opportunities. And these rules and regulations have turned Britain into a society where your life chances, such as whether you become a homeowner or not, are much more, and you've talked a bit about inheritances, but one thing I was thinking when you were giving your lecture was, if I think about my friendship group, I'm in my early 30s. When I think of my friends that have owned homes in places like London, it has typically been in part due to their income, but also in large part because they've had a family tragedy and inherited a lot of money. So your ability to actually access private home ownership has actually become increasingly affected by inheritance or transfers from parents. In effect, my argument is that our planning laws are a modern day version of the Corn Laws, creating an artificial scarcity that pushes up the price of goods that the majority of us need to get on in life, that has a regressive effect on the least well off, but also holds back the wider growth of the UK and only benefits a narrow few. So let's start with housing. So the graph there is from a paper by the Centre for Cities, my friend Sam Watling, who I think was at LSE and Anthony Breach, and they combined their data with work from the Cambridge Historical Housing Data, which is a really great resource. And what that shows is the sort of number of houses that have been built over the last century. Now, what they found in their study was that if Britain's housing stock grew in line with other European countries from about the Second World War onwards, Britain would have an extra 4 million homes. Now, we know the constraint here is the planning system, not a lack of skills in construction, not a failure of the state to build council housing, which I think you can see quite clearly there. In fact, before we brought in the current planning system that has become increasingly distortive, the private sector delivered almost all of those houses. And not because of developers distorting markets by hoarding land. So here's an interesting sort of data point. So land with planning permission can surge in value. Planning permission itself, surge in value when planning permission is granted. So planning permissions are artificially scarce. And one way you can see this is that in the most expensive parts of Britain, in some cases, it can be as much as 4 or 5 times. The cost of a house is 4 to 5 times the cost of actually building that house. What's scarce is not bricks or construction workers, but it's the permission to build that house in the first place. In some parts of the country, you could genuinely knock down a house, rebuild it, knock it down again, and then rebuild it again, and that would be a profitable thing to do if you were adding a floor each time. That seems quite mad, but that's the reality, sadly. Now, planning is restrictive because new homes impose costs on others. Most people in Britain now hold their wealth in the form of property, and they care a lot about that property. And new buildings can affect the views that your property has, which might affect the value of your property. It can mean that congestion comes into your area. Maybe you like driving to work and you don't want to spend an extra 2 minutes in traffic. Or more homes in your area might cause you to spend more time in traffic. Now, before we move to the current planning system in 1947, just after World War II, Britain used to have what was essentially a rules-based system. So London had very strict but clear rules on what you could build and where. It was designed based on logic around light planes. You could build up to 6 stories in certain parts, you could build up to 8 stories in other parts. But your right to develop was accepted provided you met these rules purely designed to prevent your impact on adjacent properties. That changed due to concerns around what's called urban sprawl or ribbon development, the idea that you could basically buy up a plot of land near a road, develop that land up, and then you could essentially impose costs on others because all of a sudden everyone would have to drive and it'd be much harder to plan public services, much more impact on traffic. That was one concern. The other concern, and it's quite ironic that this was the concern when we brought in the system, because clearly it has failed pretty significantly, was that London and the South East were building houses at an extremely high rate, and that this would make Britain a much more geographically unequal country, that the South would run away with things. And so we imposed all sorts of crazy rules. Did you know you needed specific permission from the central government to build an office north of Birmingham up until the 70s? This is kind of crazy, and actually it didn't do anything to improve regional equality. And in fact, what you actually saw was cities like Birmingham, which were once competing with London, fell massively behind. Now, the lack of homes is bad for all, but it's particularly bad for the least well off. And this comes back to my point around the growing importance of inheritance and the reduced importance of your earning power in the marketplace in terms of acquiring a house. So within London, typical young couple earning average wages would have to save for 30 years at a decent rate of saving to make a down payment on the average home in London. That limits your ability to buy in our capital city. London renters, by the way, and because you'll be renting as a result, London renters live in very crowded conditions, so they have just 25 square metres of space per person. You're probably too young to remember this, but if you remember during the London Olympics, Mitt Romney came to visit, and someone brought up a quote from his book from 2009. He'd said, "England is just a small island." That's not accurate because we're not an island, we're part of an island. But this bit was accurate. Its roads and houses are small. So, and this, like, genuinely, when I read this stat, it really floored me. Brits get less floor space per person than Manhattanites. Manhattan, the, like, densest city in the world with as little land, densest bit of the densest sort of city in the world with as little land as possible, and yet they seem to get more space than a country with huge national parks and things. You know, they've got the Central Park, but they don't have quite as much countryside as us, and yet they get more floor space per person. And high rents not only eat into incomes, but they have an even more dangerous effect, and this is what's really bad for our economy. They push people away from the best places to find a job and earn a good income. So, I've lost. I thought I had a single-sided, but I actually have a double-sided. So I need to just find which note I had. So yeah, here we go. Londoners earn 15% more than the national average. Once you factor in housing costs, however, do you know what that turns to? 1% more. So why would you move to London for a better job opportunity? Maybe one that makes use of your university degree, maybe one in a field where you see where there are big opportunities to advance in the long term, when your take-home pay is only a tiny bit higher. Moving is pretty stressful. You don't really want to leave all your friends from home behind necessarily. So as a result, you stay at home. Geographic mobility declines. In actual fact, when you look at London's population, what you see is that actually even people born in London tend to move out of London. In fact, London's population has only grown because of immigration. Amongst the domestic population, many people can't afford to live and work in London, so end up taking jobs in other parts of the country. And this is a problem because they have much higher earning power in London, and that's because London's economy is really strong. It's because and this is the classic Adam Smith point, right? The bigger the market, the more opportunities to trade, the deeper the specialisation. There's another benefit too. Big cities like London, like Cambridge, or Oxford, where they have universities, where they have specialised industries, knowledge spills over. If I'm working at an AI company and I go for a drink with another person working at a construction business, I might say to the person, "You realise that all of these blueprints could be done much faster on AI. I'll show you how to do that." All of a sudden, that person, purely because they live near me and we sometimes go to the pub, becomes more productive. This kind of benefit, which is increasingly important in the modern world, is artificially constrained by our housing shortage. And historically, we used to allow cities to grow massively. So during the Industrial Revolution, for instance, Burnley, its population in 1801 was 3,000. By the end of the century, it had grown by 30 times over to 97,000. Blackburn and Preston were under 12,000, all to over 100,000. London's population grew from 1 million to 6 million. Yet there's an amazing correlation now between your population in 1900 and your population in 2025. We've essentially got rid of the market response to housing shortage and to new industries, even though if you look at economic factors such as where the jobs are being created, where new industries are coming, that has shifted massively around the country. So that's one way in which Britain's planning system really prices workers out of good opportunities and makes their life harder. But our planning system doesn't merely price people out of our most productive places. It also saps the productivity of other major cities. So Britain has a unique challenge, and this graph helps illustrate it, although it would be nice, I think, if we had a few more labels on it in retrospect. So Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds are less productive than the national average. And that's actually really weird. So if you look at most countries, for the reasons I've said, the Smithian argument about deeper specialisation, about more job opportunities in large labour markets, you tend to find that larger cities are where people earn more. And indeed, if you look at this data, in Germany, the bigger the city gets, the more productive it is. In France, the bigger the city gets, the more productive it is. Yet if you look in Britain, the correlation is almost non-existent. That's really weird, right? And that's really not good. And why is that? So I think one of the reasons is we're thinking about city population in the wrong way. It's very easy to look at administrative figures. You know, you're covered by this council, therefore your city is this big. But as economists, is that really the right way to think of a market? I don't think it is. I think the right way to think about a market is how many people can access jobs within a certain period of time. And what we find is that Birmingham and Munich, similar in size, Leeds and Marseille, similar in size, yet during rush hour, only 34% of Birmingham's residents and 38% of Leeds residents can reach the city centre within 30 minutes via public transport. In Munich, 74% can do that. In Marseille, 87% can. Now, here's a pretty stark fact. 60 German cities have a tram. Only 7 cities in Britain do. In France, every urban area with more than 150,000 residents has a tram or a metro, while there are 30 British cities with neither. By the way, the word metro literally comes from Britain. The word we use for a public transport underground system is named after the Metropolitan line, the first underground railway in the world. And yet we, despite inventing this, which is a common theme I think you'll find with nuclear power stations, where we had the first in the world, we fell massively behind. Other countries have built more. Now look, public transport's one thing, but most Brits actually commute by car. If you look at the figures, roads in British cities are 48% more congested than roads in US cities. 15% more congested than roads in Western European cities. Fewer British cities have a mass transit system than any other Western country, including America. Britain is more reliant on slow diesel trains that break down more. This is a map, so you can kind of see, like, look how many rapid transit systems there are in Britain versus in France and Germany. That's pretty stark, I think. And so Brits also more reliant on slow diesel trains that break down more often than Germany, France or Spain, because we've failed to electrify our railways at the same rate. So there you go, UK is on 38%, Switzerland have fully electric railways, but most countries have about 2/3 of their railways electrified. So it begs the question, or prompts the question rather, why is our transport infrastructure so poor? My theory is it's down to cost. When goods are cheaper, we tend to consume more of them. But in Britain, infrastructure projects are incredibly expensive. So this is a sort of nice summary stat the Financial Times made us when we gave them our data. But it's pretty stark. Pretty much everything we do much more expensive than similar countries. And let's take trams, for example. So we built this database. It has 300 transport projects across 20 countries. And we looked at everything from trams to railways to underground railways to nuclear power stations. And the consistent thing was pretty much everything we built at a much, much higher cost than our European counterparts. We're not the worst in the world. Canada, Ireland, Australia and the US do pretty bad in a lot of these things, but we tend to be pretty rubbish. And why are we so rubbish? Why is HS2 9 times more expensive than a French high-speed rail line? Why are we paying 3 times more for a single mile of track than Germany? I think we should blame the planning system, or at least partially blame the planning system. So I'll give you a really absurd example that we came across. The government recently announced it was going to restore a railway line that they closed down in the 60s between Bristol and Portishead. This is a 3.3 mile line. The track still exists, so it's not a complex infrastructure project, one would think. And yet, getting planning permission required 79,187 pages of paperwork. Of those pages, I think around 1,000 alone were dedicated to bats, around 300 were dedicated to newts, and this is to reopen a railway line. This is to do a green thing, right? Instead of people driving from Portishead to Bristol, they could instead catch the train. Now, if all of those pages were laid end to end, it would be 4.5 times longer than the railway. So this is a fun slide. It's quite hard to see, but essentially it compares the difference in how trams are built. So in France, you can go from a tram being talked about and proposed by a council to open, and by the way, open to the extent that you have 12 miles of tram, not open with 1 or 2 miles, within about 5 years. That includes the financing, that includes the planning, that includes the construction. Let's look at the comparison with Britain. This is a tram extension in Birmingham. It's 1 mile long. It's built at almost half the cost of the 12 miles that they built in the French equivalent. First proposed 2013, planning application submitted in 2016, and before they'd done that, they would have had to have carried out environmental studies. I recently spoke to a planning consultant who said he'd recently signed off around £100,000 worth of bat surveys for building a tram in Leeds, which seems absurd to me given the fact that you're running on existing roads and you're reducing traffic. Then you then have a public inquiry, you then have a report, you then have granting only 4 years later. You then begin the preparatory work, and the hope is that next year the line will finally open for passengers. As you can see, this process is so distorted and so long for the British example, we've actually had to compress the timeline and cut 5 years off. So don't be fooled by the relative lengths. It's actually much, much, much worse. As the meme goes, you don't know how bad it is. Now look, most of us probably might have heard now about, because it's been in the news much, about the HS2's £121 million bat tunnel. And the problem there was we have a very inflexible system of environmental protection. Planning permission can only be obtained if a development complies with the EU-derived habitats regulations. So what that means is if you have a negative impact on a protected species, your project can only go ahead if 3 conditions are met. First, there has to be an overriding reason of public interest. There has to be no alternative to, you can't build a very similar line 5 metres the other side. And third, the impact can be mitigated through compensation. In the case of HS2, that compensation was a bat tunnel. Well, no, actually, so you could compensate through improving the habitat, or you could prevent the impact from taking place altogether, which is why an expensive bat tunnel was built. We deal with these impacts on a project-by-project basis. The HS2 wasn't allowed to say, look, okay, we're very bad for bats in this bit of Bedford. If you go a bit further along the line, we can build some new habitats, similar bats elsewhere. That's not allowed. And so you end up spending hundreds of millions of pounds on pretty useless bat protection, when you could probably make that money go much, 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 much further if you go, say, 10 miles up the train line or 100 miles away. So that's another problem. And then you think, okay, that's bad. We've got all these lengthy environmental assessment, all these rules about what you can and can't build. But even when you comply with all these rules, so even when you've done your 80,000 page planning application, and by the way, some planning applications can be 300,000 pages long. Some environmental impact assessments can be 44,000 pages long alone. Even when you've done all of this, you can still get sued. And in the UK, we have a really weird system. So normally, if I were to say, launch a lawsuit against you because I thought your business was doing something wrong. Now, if my case is rubbish, but I've wasted months of your time, I've forced you to hire a lawyer when you shouldn't have to hire a lawyer, and you've paid all sorts of expenses to that lawyer. When the judge says, look, you don't have a case here, I'm ruling against you, by the way, you need to pay that person for the legal costs you've imposed upon them. That applies to almost every area of law in Britain. But when it comes to objections to planning applications and things on the grounds of environmental protection alone, there's a thing called the cost protection rules, which is based off a treaty that was signed in, I think Denmark? Is Aarhus, or is that Sweden? Denmark, yeah. So treaty we signed in Denmark in 2001. Now these rules weren't explicitly spelled out, but our courts decided to interpret this treaty as implying that we need to have these rules. And what it means is those lawsuits, if I've wasted £100,000 of your money on hiring expensive lawyers to fight this case and produce mountains of paperwork, you only get to claim £5,000 back if I'm an individual suing you, or £10,000 if I'm an organisation suing you. So effectively, mounting lawsuits against infrastructure projects is subsidised by the state. And these costs can be humongous. So I was involved with setting up a thing called the Banner Review, which was a government review into cost and how to mitigate inappropriate legal challenges to infrastructure projects. One of the questions that was asked was, how much do one of these legal challenges cost you? And National Highways, who are tasked with building our biggest roads, said that the average project costs, a lawsuit would cost them around 60 to 120 million pounds when you factor in both the legal costs, but also the fact that your project can't take place instantly and you have another year to wait. That means potential capital costs in terms of the financing you can raise, and it means also costs in terms of inflation. And there's another problem, right? Britain has very, very small construction companies. Our biggest construction company is around 6 or 7 times smaller than the biggest French construction company or the biggest Spanish construction company. And the reason is, if you have such an uncertain or risky planning system, you end up in a situation where the chances are that you have a project on the go and then it gets cancelled, and you all of a sudden have thousands of people on your books and lots of equipment that's sitting idle. That can send you bankrupt. So instead we rely heavily on subcontractors, which means we have a much less efficient construction sector because they cannot benefit from economies of scale. That's transport. I should say, by the way, that 360,000 page planning application, we sent a freedom of information request to National Highways, and we asked them, how much did it cost you to produce that application alone? This isn't factoring in the all the other preparatory works they would have done for this infrastructure, which comes to 1 billion in total. This is purely complying with planning legislation. They told us they'd spent £295 million on a single planning application. That's £295 million of taxpayer money on one arm of the government trying to persuade another arm of the government that a project that is supported by around 80% of people local to it should not go ahead, despite the government having a national policy statement and a road investment strategy that says this project is necessary. And by the way, this project still hasn't been granted planning permission, and I am assured by the people involved in it that they know that the moment they are approved for planning permission, they will spend a year fighting lawsuits. And the budget has grown by a few billions. And now that £295 million, that's actually twice as much as it cost Norway to build the world's longest road tunnel. You could build the world's longest road tunnel and the world's deepest subsea tunnel for the same price. Right, that's transport. Energy, finally. Britain has the highest industrial energy costs in the world, and yet new energy infrastructure is extremely difficult to build. Even things, like I said with trams, things that are like unequivocally good for the environment, so say offshore wind, right? Renewable energy that's produced domestically. East Anglia 2 is a wind farm that will power 800,000 homes. to get planning permission, 85,000-page planning application, and an environmental statement that was about as long as the complete works of Tolstoy plus the complete works of Proust. When the project was finally approved, lawsuit, another year delay, and while construction has been delayed, we've seen massive increases in the cost of building offshore wind farms because wind turbines are made out of metal. Metal requires a lot of electricity to produce. Electricity is more expensive now since Russia invaded Ukraine. So again, big costs to the public. Sizewell C, this is a nuclear power station that is proposed. It has planning permission, but they're still trying to agree funding. That had an even longer planning application, 44,000-page environmental impact assessment. That's twice as long as the complete works of Proust, Tolstoy and Shakespeare combined. And nuclear not only has to contend with planning bureaucracy, so Hinkley Point C, which is so we've not built a nuclear power station in 30 years. We used to build loads. As late as 1965, Britain had more nuclear power stations installed than the rest of the world combined. This is an industry we've pioneered, an industry that was once very cheap to build it. But now, we are the most expensive place to build nuclear power in the world. If we could build at South Korean or even French costs, we would probably build a lot more nuclear power because it can produce reliable, zero carbon energy. Sadly, we have, and I think actually this chart is mildly out of date because the UK figure averages Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C, and Sizewell C's estimate of costs has increased quite significantly since. So again, it's even worse than my graphs tell you. But when they went going through the process for Hinkley Point C, what we saw was the Office for Nuclear Regulation, which is our safety regulator. They're guided by a principle which is known as a LARP, which is as low as reasonably practicable. And the way that kind of works is, if you've discovered a productivity improvement, the regulator can then go, well, if you can build a nuclear power station for £12 billion using, and you just found a £500 million cost saving, could you not do £500 million worth of safety measures? And so we've got to the point where, at one point we were spending money to reduce exposure to radiation in a way that was sensible. We are now chasing extremely small levels of radiation. We're talking about the sort of radiation you get from drinking 30 cups of coffee. So yeah, it's got very silly. And when they were going through this process, this regulator, they requested 7,000 changes to Hinkley Point C's design, not based off the core design itself, but based off the same design that was being used in Finland and France. The Finnish regulator said this is okay, the French regulator said this is okay, the British regulator said there are about 7,000 things that need to change. Now, some of those things were requiring an analogue backup. Some of those things were about requiring an acoustic fish deterrent, which is known colloquially as the fish disco, which is essentially installing speakers underneath the intake pipe to get the water to cool down the reaction. What that does is, the idea is it sends fish away and fewer fish go through and come out very warm on the other side, probably poached, I would say, at the temperatures we're looking at. Now, the fish disco, actually, they fought this change, and they fought the change for so long, so I think they've been fighting since about 2017. They were trying to instead say, look, can't we just flood some farmland, and birds and fish can use that farmland as a new habitat? Seems a sensible approach. However, they were having trouble getting the planning permission to do that in the first place as well. And what happened along the way is the fish disco technology, which they were concerned about because installing speakers in really dark water with tidal flows is really dangerous. And nuclear power stations are really safe, but they might be the one nuclear power station to have an employee die, not because of radiation, but because they required them to swim in really dark, murky water to fix the speaker to tell fish to stay away. Not great. And all of this means that when we build a nuclear reactor in Britain, we're building a reactor for the first time. And all the construction risk comes when you build a reactor brand new. What you see is South Korea, they build a reactor, it starts off a little bit expensive, and then you dramatically see over the 5th, 6th reactor, costs fall. We don't get those benefits from learning. And this is really bad for the economy, because if you push up the price of energy, this hurts poor people in 2 key ways. So the poorest households spend much more of their income on energy bills, so planning restrictions that make it harder to build new energy infrastructure hurt them much, much more than the rest of the country. You know, everyone in the country will soon be paying 80p extra on their energy bills, in part to fund payments to people who live near pylons and otherwise object to the pylons being built near them. That's a pretty small scale thing, but if you add up all of these planning disputes, it suddenly has quite a big impact on your energy bills. But it's not just household energy bills, it's also industries. So chemicals, concrete, steel. Because we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the world, the end result has been essentially a rapid decline since the Ukraine invasion, and those prices hit that level. So you've seen chemicals industry fall by about 30% in the last few years, similar in concrete, similar in steel. Steel seems to be an ongoing concern where every few years it sounds like the steel industry will die for good in Britain, and then the government fishes out some cash to try and save it, but they don't solve the underlying problem, which is you can't build energy cheaply to power these buildings and foundries and so on and so forth. So I think there's a historical analogy here, right? The rules that prevent us from building new homes, railways, power plants, they are the modern day Corn Laws. In the 19th century, the supply of food into cities was restricted by really high tariffs. The laws enriched a few wealthy landowners, and this was a time when we didn't have universal suffrage, so they had disproportionate power over the political process, but they came at a cost to the many, the people working in cities and factories who couldn't feed themselves adequately. And not only did this mean that those people living in cities found it hard to feed themselves and had lower incomes, but it also meant the growth of cities was constrained, the growth of our industrial economy was constrained. Now, the fight to repeal the Corn Laws was extremely hard fought. It broke apart traditional political coalitions. It required a popular movement. The Anti-Corn Law League, they held events up and down the country and really sort of changed politics. Britain Remade, the campaign I work for, we see ourselves as kind of a modern day anti-Corn Law League. Instead of targeting high tariffs, which thankfully are very, very low, although if you look at America, they're now rising to pre-World War II levels, which is not ideal, and maybe anti-tariff campaigning will come back again.
Let's hope.
But we started up because our founder, Sam Richards, he was working for a Prime Minister, a chap named Boris Johnson. He was the energy advisor, and what he founded was when they wanted to build new energy infrastructure, every single time all of the politicians would sort of say, yes, that'd be a good thing to do, and then they would soon get letters from concerned local residents who were concerned about the view, were concerned about its impact on nature. But what they never heard about was the rest of us who want cheaper energy, who want us to switch from fossil fuels to cleaner renewable energy or nuclear power. They never heard from the people who want cheaper housing, who want better public transport, even though they seem to always vote for the party promising the most economic change. They vote for Brexit because they don't think the current system's working. They vote for Jeremy Corbyn because they're unhappy with politics. Then they vote for Boris Johnson because they're unhappy with the way things are going, and now they might vote for reform. It's clearly they're not satisfied by how the economy is going, and yet every single time politicians listen to a very small segment of that electorate. We exist to change that. Our idea is to get Britain building again and ensure that people who write our laws hear not just from the landowners, the homeowners who lose out, but they also hear from all the rest of us who would benefit from cheaper housing, would benefit from cheaper energy, who would benefit from our cities having trams and better buses and better tube lines and more electrified railways and so on and so forth. So if you like that idea, you can join our campaign, and maybe I can tell you a bit more about some of the ideas we have to change that in the Q&A. Thanks.
That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to come take a seat, Sam. I absolutely love that we've effectively had two, what I would say, different stories in terms of how positive and negative they might feel, but effectively of the same sort of strand of thought, which I think is really quite interesting as well. I've actually got a bit of a theory about the tariffs that we're seeing over in the US. I think that we could see a huge flooding of the steel market globally because Canada will need to dump them somewhere, and I think that actually we might see cheaper steel in the UK. Well, that's a bit of an undecided theory. Well, thank you both for your really interesting lectures. I think that was really interesting, and we will definitely hear from the audience with some of those questions as well. But to start off, I've got a couple of questions for the two of you, just to get that kind of started. So, Professor Waldenstrom, we've heard a little bit about how we have become a lot wealthier, and the fact that we have become a lot wealthier globally. I wanted to hear a little bit about why there has been that shift between the 19th and the 20th century. So why is it you think we are getting wealthier overall in the West, and the reasons for that, and of course how we can unleash that towards the future?
Okay, tiny question. Thank you.
Just a small question.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think, in fact, looking historically, I think the Industrial Revolution is the kind of the key answer for why we left the more stationary agrarian society and entered the era of sustained increase of like purchasing power and human welfare. So that is kind of the short answer. So why in that era at least? But what you also allude to maybe is how it came about that normal people also could be part of that process. I mean, this is what I was talking about, to combine the economic growth with the institutional contexts. And I think a theme is the democratically embedded market economy. I think that's the most important contribution of maybe Western Europe, Western world to mankind in the recent era, really having lifted populations and people from really bad states to better states. And this is also what we see the poor countries and the low-income countries, middle-income countries are opting for. They want to mimic us in that sense. Our challenge today would then, of course, be how to get that without getting some of these themes or the problems that we haven't talked about today very much, but I think climate. So pollution is should be a top priority. I have myself, I'm the first to admit, not thought enough on that. How to think about reforming our systems and about taxation and organization of society so that we can get a sustainable future in that sense too, and also by including these groups. I think electrical vehicles is just one fantastic example of that. And I think, for example, LED lighting, having the same light with a fractional of energy consumption, for me, that is growth.
Yeah.
So that's what's going to be a very crucial part of the solution.
In some ways, some of the answer is in what Sam said about nuclear energy. The fact that we're not able to build any of those nuclear power stations in the first place is probably part of why we've not been able to do that. And actually, when you're really thinking about it from a climate perspective, somebody like Elon Musk, and I didn't say his name explicitly, probably has done more to reduce carbon emissions than anybody else because of the cheaper electric vehicles.
Let me just add on that. So I think one main question that people are discussing and that we are discussing here today: who's gonna do this for us? I mean, is it I think the first division is the public sector or the private sector. So in my history, I think I wanted to highlight the fact that even in our economies with a lot of redistribution, we have high taxes, historically high taxes, and a lot of emphasis on egalitarian policies to include people. And yet, I think in the orders of magnitude, I think it is the private sector advancements that have lifted people and into better living standards. And this is at least one clue, although I think we need coordination, we need planning to some extent, but the problem is so if you have people in the transport ministries, the bureaucrats, politically led organizations, who have not yet been able to do this for us in an efficient manner, why should we think that they should all of a sudden start doing it if they get more money?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, yeah. So
from a growth perspective, I think that thinking about growth is coming from the private sector predominantly. I mean, at the moment in the UK, as a very specific example where so sort of your argument is talking about the fact that growth as a whole has increased, that, you know, as a whole, the world is a lot wealthier today. We know that even based on things like health outcomes, child mortality rates are significantly lower today than they ever have been. But the UK, in comparison to other countries, is growing at a lot slower rate, and actually we're seeing economic stagnation. Just moving on to Sam, just on that specific point, there's clearly a political problem, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit with the sort of smaller voices that are a bit louder. Can I hear a show of hands? Who's heard of the term NIMBY? Has anybody heard of the term NIMBY? Can anybody explain what a NIMBY is? Or what they might think it might be? Yep, go on.
It's like not in my backyard, so there are some people who are NIMBY against like windmills.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. So NIMBY is not in my backyard. These are smaller voices that tend to be quite loud that often block planning development. Because almost it feels a bit like a no-brainer, right? If we were to reform the planning system, we're able to unleash economic growth. I mean, who knows how wealthy the UK specifically could be if we were to have done that. Sam, could you explain this political problem a bit for us? Why have we not solved this problem?
Yeah, and I think that the political economy is slightly different on energy than it is on housing. So when it comes to energy, there are enormous national benefits to more energy infrastructure, such that if you really were determined to, which is I think what this current government is, they're less reliant on rural votes. You can essentially crush the opposition. You can say, we've got 80, you've got 20, we're going to win this political debate, and we'll take a bit of a political hit from these people because we know we're going to deliver for these people. Now, your charts showed that if you look at home ownership, most people are homeowners. That's a problem, right? When you're thinking about how do you expand the supply of housing. Most people would benefit from there being more housing, because even if you are a homeowner, you can move to a larger, more pleasant property. You wouldn't be stuck in a property smaller than what you get in Manhattan at roughly the same price, and you wouldn't be stuck in a property that's as, you know, cold. Britons have the coldest homes in Europe because we also have the oldest homes in Europe, because we haven't built many homes in the last sort of 50, 60 years. Now, the challenge there is coming up with politically sustainable mechanisms to get around the problem of development creating large gains across the economy, but gains that are spread extremely thin, and very, very large concentrated losses. One solution, my friend John Myers, he's a campaigner on this, he's got an idea called street votes. And, you know, when I lose my right to build, when we have a planning system that says you can't build your house, it's also a planning system that means that I can't expand my house. Those sets of rules, if you were going to expand your house and I wasn't, you could look down on me, you could cast a shadow on me, that would be inconvenient to me. But if we could both agree to say we both allow our houses to go one story up, both of us are richer. So can you actually come up with mechanisms to say that those win-win situations, which I think are very common, if you devolve down not the level of councils, but even the level of individual streets, individual neighbourhoods, and come up with probably I would say maybe, okay, Hayek program, I can't say the greatest thinker from the LSE, but up there, Ronald Coase.
Yes.
His idea of Coasean bargaining, the essential thing there, when you have these problems where you're imposing costs on others, one way you can resolve them is by state invention, but another way is by trading. The problem is you can't really trade over an entire borough with hundreds of thousands of people without maybe AI will enable us to come up with these trades because they can handle all the negotiations for us, but you probably need very expensive lawyers to do something like this, and it's not worth it. But on an individual street level, or an individual or a small level like that, you might actually be able to come to a solution where you say, look, we can, and there's actually a good example, right? Like, this is how NIMBY should behave. we should look at the Queen. She recently was concerned that there was going to be a hotel built near her, and they would have loud parties, and it would prevent her from enjoying her property. She didn't object to the planning permission. She bought the other property. That's the Kosian solution. And it would be cool if that was how people responded to these things. They came to agreements, they came to deals. But that's very difficult to do. So the other thing you can do is what you might call spot paint, right? Lots and lots of people could potentially live in very small parts of the country, right, in terms of geographical area. You could probably say, if I'm a political party, and the Conservatives were sort of coming to this conclusion at the last election, we probably might not hold South Cambridgeshire anyway. However, Cambridge is an extremely important part of our economy, and it's something where if we were to expand it, we could produce massive land value uplift, we could expand our AI sector, we could expand our world-leading universities. This is a really good thing. Let's take the political loss here and concentrate as much housing as possible by moving to an ideal, extremely liberal system for house building in this small geographic area. It's not beautiful, it's not like elegant, but it is a politically savvy way of doing things. I think Labour have sort of cottoned onto that with their reforms of the Greenbelt, because they know that the people who live in Greenbelt constituencies, where you're in a more rural area, are probably less likely to vote Labour and they're probably Tory Lib Dem marginals. So the political cost of building in those areas is limited. But this gets into kind of more hard-nosed politics. There are more elegant solutions, hopefully.
Hopefully. Well, I think street votes I've always found quite an interesting solution to that. But I think it's important for that to be a point to be raised, effectively, that it feels like a no-brainer that the regulatory system should be at least reformed to some extent, and actually that it's completely obvious that we need to be building certain things that we are currently not. But the thing that the barrier to that is ultimately politics, and that it didn't really make sense that the Conservative governments didn't build in Labour areas or Labour strongholds, because it wouldn't have affected their particular votes. Dan, if I may, back to you, specifically on things that, when you've got this sort of prevailing narrative or the prevailing argument, and you alluded to it in your lecture, that the world is getting poorer, or that inequality is rising, or that effectively there are huge numbers of people that are becoming poor. I mean, I often see the statistic in the UK where people say that child poverty is increasing. My colleague Christopher Snowdon actually placed a bet against an academic who said that child poverty was going to increase, and then he won that bet, that it didn't actually increase at all. But how do you respond directly to those prevailing narratives that the world is getting poorer and the cause is globalization or capitalism or whatever it may be? How would you respond directly to those?
I mean, that's a great question and a great, challenge. First of all, because the world is very complex. As an academic, it's easy to present a complex picture and then let the others just interpret and then do whatever they want, and we don't care, because we are just trying our best to describe reality as it is. So, by taking one step further, trying to understand, for example, when it comes to the inequality debate. So I think one could think about, one of the problems is that the groups in society that are interested in inequality questions are typically left of center groups they have realized that these are interesting questions, important to people, also important for society. The problem with them is that they don't care about research or facts, because they already know the answer. Yeah. Inequality is always too high, and it's always increasing. So they don't really care a lot about what we say, and with our nuances. The right of center people, on the other hand, they don't care at all. They don't want to talk about inequality or these distributional problems, so they have that total walkover. And then that is, to start talking about this, saying that it is important. And we could add on dimensions about inequality of wealth that I talked about today, inequality of wages or income, or we could talk about men and women and so on. we have to accept that there is not one single narrative or one single solution. I think, in fact, what I like with Sam's talk, and I think as a general rule, whenever I think about policy making and so on, is to have a comparative perspective. What works in other countries? So, how have they managed to overcome some of these lock-in situations? Or what? And also, and this is another lesson that I've learned. I mean, I gave a talk about fiscal policy rules in Sweden. There was an investigation wanting to lax the central bank independence of Sweden, wanting to increase government budget borrowing. Sorry. And I said I had many complaints about that, and a person that listened to my talk, he said like, okay, Daniel, you're right, you're perfectly right, but don't sound so negative all the time. Don't just complain all the time. What are the solutions? Find the positive examples how to improve matters instead, and we can learn from others. So that's at least one very instructive and constructive way to go about. Where has it worked? And I think, especially when it comes to these comparative examples, try to mimic. That would be a very, very quick way of improving and making arbitrage that we talk about in the financial economics. I don't know, I didn't answer your question. I just threw out some of my darlings, but I think this is important stuff that
It is really important because the prevailing narrative is the opposite. I think that's the point. And I think, it's interesting definitely from that perspective. Before we go to Q&A, I'm going to ask you both the same question. So I'm of the view, generally speaking, and it seems as though both of you are in agreement, that economic growth is good. And it seems to me that the majority of the political elites, I suppose, in the UK at least, are now in agreement, although it certainly hasn't always been the case. Especially from an environmental perspective, there have been many people that have been arguing for degrowth. It seems to me those people aren't necessarily at the forefront of public debate, and that economic growth and wealth creation, if you will, is a good thing. In your view, how do we unleash economic growth, both globally and in the UK?
So, I mean, the obvious answer for Britain, I think, is tackle the problem, the thing that we do worst. We have so many economic strengths. We have universities that people from all around the world want to come and study at. That's hard to replicate. Other countries would love to be able to replicate that, but they can't. We have a great venture capital system. We have the City of London. We have the legal system. We have a great time zone. Lots of these things other countries would dream of, but they can't have. The problem is we make it very, very hard for many of our industries to succeed, for people to work in those really high-paid jobs, because we have a system that makes it extremely difficult to build. So make it easier to build. So one thing we could do is to look at London, for instance, and say, we should have many, many more people living in London. There shouldn't be tracts of London known as strategic industrial land where new house building can't go ahead because the land is reserved purely for industrial use, even though we're a city that prides itself on its service economy.
Yeah.
So we're building a massive train station, Old Oak Common, which will have a massive interchange with the Elizabeth line, 5 tube lines. We're banning housing, basically, on large parts of it. We're delivering fewer homes on this plot of land than Manchester United are proposing to build on the old site of Old Trafford. It's really
because the government decided it's reserved for industrial use.
Exactly. That's one example. We should look at what works elsewhere. So in New Zealand, they moved to a system where new housing within short walking distance of a bus stop or a train stop or a tram stop is automatically approved up to about 5-6 stories. That immediately creates a much more predictable and much more liberal planning system. That led to a big increase in housing growth, and over the past 10 years, if you look at the rents in Auckland and you compare them to similar parts of New Zealand who hadn't had these reforms, they now all have these reforms. you see that rents are about 33% lower than they otherwise would be. That'd be humongous change to our economy, and more people in that situation would then be able to live in London and benefit from London wages, and you'd see a growing economy. A final thing, and this is something the government have talked about doing, and they've got close to doing, but they're not going all the way, and that's moving from a system of environmental protection that's based on new projects and plans solely, and that's based on a project by project basis. Instead of saying that HS2 has to build a bat tunnel to mitigate this specific impact, why don't we say you can pay into a fund that helps protect bats around the country? We can save more bats that way, but we can also speed up development, because lengthy negotiations and money on pointless solutions doesn't have to happen. That's the sort of change that we need, I think.
And same question, how would you like to see economic growth unleashed in the future?
I'll make it short. So I think two things. So structural reforms. So we talked about now planning, for example, and how to think about making changes in infrastructure and so on. How to make less of that in terms of bureaucracies, rules that or like that kind of paper handling, rent regulation. The good thing with structural reforms is that they don't need to cost a lot. They don't go on the budget, which is typically a very large problem. So basically increase effectiveness or efficiency both in the private sector but also in the public sector. I think public sector, for example, measuring output in the public sector. Sometimes we talk about new public management, sometimes in condescending tone, but that's a way to think about what are we doing with the tax money to provide services in the welfare systems, and how can we improve in terms of handling errands in the bureaucracies, how many operations do we have for each surgeon and so on. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is taxation. The challenge with taxation is that it's in the budget, it becomes very visible. But I think, for example, in the context of AI, we talk about AI, and I see with increasing fear how many forces now want to build up funds and resources in the public sector to spend on AI investments. The problem is that what we've seen so far is that AI advancements have not come through public investment projects, but through a more spontaneous process of lower taxes and creating incentives to make AI improvements. So I think lower taxes, but also then these structural reforms.
Excellent, thank you so much. We've got a bit of time for questions. Can I see a show of hands how many questions we have? We've got 1, 2. Okay, we've got about 7-8 minutes left. Let's take the questions and then we can see what we'd like to respond to. Let's start over here.
One opinions about
So, can we get too much wealth? Other questions? Hands up. Yeah, these two. Yeah.
How do you build housing and at the same time promote homeownership as a form of wealth building?
And yeah.
I have a question for Daniel. Is that in the graph of wealth inequality, you showed from the 20th century trend, it was going down. And you mentioned that you said war is not really the reason due to there are certain countries, for example, Spain and Sweden, that was not involved in the war. However, I feel like it's based on the assumption that it seems like those countries are completely isolated from the war-taking ground. So it's saying, but during that time, we saw a lot of social changes caused by the general environment and the war, which made, I think, a lot of social changes which decrease the wealth inequality. And then second is that also during the graph, we can see that since the neoliberal policy after 1980, we see an increasing trend. And I think the trend is increasing upward. So how would you, if you believe that war and tax system was not the reason, and how would you explain the pivot point of the increasing wealth inequality?
Okay. Other questions? Hands up. Oh, great. Okay, let's go start here and we'll go around.
Cool. Yeah. It's for Professor Daniel. You said that rich people are not interested in being powerful. For example, I think it's changing, a lot. Like when you're talking about Jeff Bezos, he's the owner of Washington Post. I would say, Elon Musk, and somehow like I think he started building the satellites, but he never thought about, censorship, like which most of the satellites back in time, like Canada, control and this kind of thing. I think it's changing like back in time. Don't you think like more and more we need, like I was covering I'm a journalist I was covering the farmers' protest, like don't you think we need more and more, I would say, wealth people like investing or being interested in controlling, I would say, or creating some more websites, like to spread their idea, for example, Dumitriu, like has his website, like to prove, like we got some guys, like for example, founding, like journalists, like to talk about much more like about, civil construction, about the farmers and stuff like that, to do not, spread that idea like, oh, wealth is no good at all, rich people are bad, like these kind of things.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you think inheritance makes wealth distribution unequal?
Inheritance. Yeah.
Your statistics focus mainly on the top percentiles and the middle class. But how do these trends look for the lowest percentiles in the economy? And is the change in wealth distribution mainly driven by the middle classes and not so much by the lower?
Excellent. Okay, we've got a couple of questions there. Let's see if we can pick up on some of them. So we've got something on towns, we've got home ownership. For you, on whether or not war on taxes are actually impacting inequality, inheritance tax, and those lower percentiles as well. So do you want to pick up some?
Absolutely. Excellent questions, and these are the things that I want to spend the rest of the night sitting. I can sit here the rest of the night discussing these things. The first question on kind of can we have too much wealth? So it was a little bit like in the context of like the boundaries also of Earth potentially. I mean, this is in fact when it comes to zero-sum thinking, I think when I talk to people in the environmental groups, they have very much that, and it guides their thinking to a large extent. So whenever rich countries do things, they use the resources that otherwise could have been used by lower income countries and so on. I mean, that's at least, that context, and I think growth and wealth and value is kind of, these are monetary things. And economists are not that good in quantities, but we look at values, prices and quantities, meaning that if you do something better, for example, inventing the LED lighting, something that everybody buys, will make you very wealthy, and yet you will also get more out of less. So more lighting out of less resources. That is also growth. Growth is productivity increases, meaning that we do more out of the same resources, or we can do the same out of less resources. So this is wealth generating processes. I mean, the alternative is to have like profitable and wealthy corporations. Would we prefer them to not make profits or maybe go bankrupt? And I don't think so. But it's a very good question, and I think economists are not the best to address all the environmental questions. We also have to pick up, to think about boundaries, tipping points, and so on. Wars, equalizing wars, definitely. So the direct effect of wars destroying factories of the rich, held by the rich and so on, that's just one way of thinking about how wars affected our economies. Yes, we have war regulation. So in Sweden, for example, we have one still big Second World War regulation in our economy, namely the rent regulation. We don't have free pricing in rental markets. So that is something that affected capital accumulation and so on, despite us not being part of the war. So that's true. It's just that I think the effect on lowering capital accumulation in the top is not what is driving the equalization. So it was not the outright destruction or not the capital accumulation hampering effects of these taxes, because when we look at capital growth in the top, it's just not decreasing. It's maybe slower but it's still like dwarfed by the growth from below. So this is my point. But definitely wars did matter. Increases since 1980. I mean, we can think about nuances, and when we talk about these small changes, I think some of it was due to this pickup of incentives and growth in our economies. The little I know about the UK from the 1970s is that there were a lot of problems. You had strikes, we had low growth, we had entire industries leaving Western Europe, shipbuilding, textiles, because we were so bad, over-regulated and overtaxed. So we wanted to create incentives. Some of that led to new companies being created, maybe even internet and like new technologies and so on and so forth. So yes, there has been some, but then there's some increases in wealth.
Daniel, just
But
very quickly, sorry.
sorry,
No, it's okay.
power and wealth. The point is, I just say that the vast majority of rich people are not into politics. There are some. We can talk about Bezos or Musk. We can talk about Silvio Berlusconi was one very famous example.
George Soros.
There are many such examples. It's just that most wealthy people are not into politics. You don't even need to be a billionaire to be influential. I mean, you can have some millions and still become influential. In fact, and also we don't know very much about those links. So if you're interested, there was a fantastic debate between Larry Summers and Emmanuel Saez at the Peterson Institute in 2021, I think. I can recommend it. It's on the internet, addressing these questions. Inheritance and wealth inequality. Very good question. I skipped over a few slides on that. As it turns out, in the US, Sweden, Denmark, rich heirs, pre-inheritance rich heirs, they inherit more money. So we have a generational correlation. Rich parents typically have rich kids. But, well, the inheritance is more important for lower, like poorer heirs. So we actually have a compression of wealth inequality within heirs. And finally, in the lower parts of the distribution. What about that? I have that more in my book.
I think we'll have to leave that for the break. I'm very sorry, but just because we have to wrap up now, we'll be able to answer some of your questions.
You have to read the book to get that answer.
All right, very good, very good.
Thanks for that.
Thank you so much, both of you. Sam, you can answer some of your questions in the break if some of you want to come over as well. I would recommend leaving your bags on your chairs because there'll be more people coming in for the rest of the break as well. Big round of applause to Sam.